Imagine a young lady no older than 16 who is a slave on a Deep South plantation. She is expecting her first child, which she knows she won't be keeping. Though afraid, she nevertheless has hope for her child's future, hoping that it will be better than her own. As her belly grows, so do her fears. She watches as other pregnant women on the plantation are worked to the brink of exhaustion and forced to carry out the same grueling work as the other enslaved people. But she knows that if she can't keep up, her punishment will be severe. As her due date approaches, the fear turns to terror. She knows that childbirth is dangerous for any woman, but for an enslaved woman, it's even more so. She has no doctors to assist her, no midwives to offer guidance. Her only support comes from the other enslaved women on the plantation who strive to help her through the ordeal. But the horrors persist beyond childbirth. If she survives, she'll be required to resume work within days, balancing the care of her newborn while toiling in the fields without respite. And if her child is taken away, as was frequently done, she'll endure the heartbreak of potentially never seeing her baby again. This is the grim reality that enslaved women endured during pregnancy and childbirth, yet it's a reality often obscured from history. While slavery's brutality is taught in schools, the specific horrors faced by pregnant women are rarely discussed. In this video, we aim to unveil the hidden history of the inhumane treatment of enslaved women during pregnancy and childbirth, shining a light on voices silenced for too long. Before we delve into this vital exploration, please consider subscribing and liking the video to help us amplify Black stories. Disclaimer: the story you are about to hear contains harrowing details of the experiences of pregnant enslaved Black women. Viewer discretion is advised.
It's for the people.
I know exactly who I am and where I came from.
Who are you then?
I'm free.
The practice of breeding enslaved people like cattle wasn't novel. It was a calculated and systematic strategy aimed at increasing the number of slaves and, consequently, the wealth of slave owners. Let's rewind to the early 1600s when the transatlantic slave trade commenced. The initial enslaved Africans arrived in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. At that time, slavery wasn't yet defined by race, but rather by being captured and sold into servitude. However, this soon evolved as slavery became more profitable. Laws were enacted to ensure lifelong enslavement for Africans, who were deemed property and devoid of rights. By the 1800s, slave breeding became a lucrative enterprise, leading to the establishment of breeding farms and houses nationwide. One notorious example was a farm in Virginia owned by Thomas Jefferson, ironically the same man who penned the phrase, "All men are created equal." Despite his status as a founding father, Jefferson owned over 600 slaves, many of whom he used for breeding purposes. In recent years, statues of Thomas Jefferson have been toppled due to growing awareness of his involvement in the exploitation of pregnant enslaved Black women. His legacy, once celebrated, is now being re-evaluated in light of his role in perpetuating the suffering of these vulnerable individuals. This deplorable practice wasn't exclusive to Jefferson. It was widespread among other slave owners who viewed female slaves as mere property to exploit. Enslaved women, already stripped of their humanity, were further subjected to the horrors of being used for their reproductive capabilities. Their children were torn from them at birth and sold like commodities, inflicting unimaginable emotional trauma upon countless enslaved mothers. One of the most notorious breeding farms was called the Weeping Time, which was located in Savannah, Georgia. This farm was owned by Pierce Meese Butler, a wealthy plantation owner who inherited the farm from his grandfather. Butler was a cruel and heartless man who saw nothing wrong with using enslaved women as breeders. Shockingly, he is also one of the founding fathers of the United States of America. The conditions in these breeding farms and houses were deplorable. The women were forced to live in small, cramped quarters with little to no ventilation. They were given barely enough food to survive, and their medical needs were completely ignored. Pregnant women were forced to work in the fields up until the day they gave birth, and even after giving birth, their babies were taken away from them and sold to other plantation owners while the women were forced to continue working. These women were denied the basic right to be mothers and to care for their children. One woman in particular stands out. Her name was Harriet Jacobs, and she was enslaved in North Carolina. Harriet was forced to have a sexual relationship with her owner, and as a result, she became pregnant. Her owner's wife became jealous and started to mistreat her. Harriet knew that her child would be taken away from her, so she decided to run away and hide in a small attic space in her grandmother's house. For 7 years, Harriet lived in that small attic space, watching her children grow up without her. This is just one of the many horrific stories that show that detail the sufferings of enslaved women. In the U.S., enslaved women were not only forced to have breed with men who were specifically chosen to produce the best possible offspring, but also denied the basic right to care for their children. But the horrors did not end. Their enslaved women were subjected to cruel and dangerous birthing practices that often resulted in injury, infection, and death. Enslaved women were frequently compelled to give birth on the plantation floor, devoid of any medical assistance or pain relief. They were sometimes subjected to cruel practices like the breaking of the pelvis, intended to constrain and subdue them. This procedure, aimed at widening the birth canal to facilitate delivery, was carried out without anesthesia, often resulting in irreversible harm to the woman's body. The method involved the use of a pelvimeter, a large instrument inserted into the woman's vagina to measure the width of her pelvis. If deemed too narrow, the operator would forcibly break or separate the pelvic bones using a wooden spatula or similar tool, causing extreme pain, trauma, and long-term physical disabilities. Another method employed to restrain and subdue enslaved women during childbirth was the use of a birthing chair. This chair featured straps or ropes to hold the woman's legs apart, with a hole in the seat allowing the baby to be delivered directly onto the ground. While facilitating the delivery process for slave owners or midwives, it made it challenging for the woman to move or control her body during labor. Enslaved women often endured these and other barbaric birthing practices without their consent or understanding of the procedures inflicted upon them. Adding to the injustice, the media has attempted to conceal this aspect of history, resulting in limited written documentation regarding the breaking of the pelvis or the use of birthing chairs during slavery. During that era, enslaved women were often deprived of access to education and prohibited from learning to read or write. Due to the deliberate suppression of their voices and experiences by those in power, they were unable to confront this brutality or document their suffering. However, some accounts and records have emerged, shedding light on these atrocious practices. One such account comes from Harriet Jacobs, an enslaved woman who managed to escape from slavery in North Carolina in 1842. In her autobiography titled Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Jacobs vividly describes the use of the birthing chair to restrain and subdue enslaved women during childbirth. She also provides first-hand accounts of the trauma and physical harm inflicted by the practice of breaking the pelvis. Another account emerges from a physician named James Marion Sims, who conducted dreadful experiments and surgeries on enslaved women. It is noteworthy that these practices were not confined to the United States, but were also prevalent in other regions where slavery existed, such as the Caribbean and South America. There are reports of the use of the birthing chair in Jamaica, for instance, and of the pelvis-breaking practice in Brazil. You might assume that the horrors end here, but pregnant women on slave breeding farms faced even more unimaginable atrocities. These women were also subjected to medical experiments and surgeries, as doctors used them as subjects for various experiments. These included testing new surgical procedures, experimenting with drugs and medications, and even using them as guinea pigs for medical research. One of the most infamous examples of such exploitation was the work of Dr. James Marion Sims, often hailed as the father of modern gynecology. Sims is a well-known figure in the medical field for his pioneering work. However, his achievements were built upon the exploitation of enslaved black women whom he experimented on without anesthesia or their consent. Sims held the belief that black women did not experience pain in the same manner as white women, thus neglecting to provide anesthesia during his surgeries. He conducted numerous experiments on enslaved women, sometimes performing up to 30 surgeries on a single individual. Many of these surgeries aim to address conditions like vesico-vaginal fistulas, which arise as complications of childbirth and result in incontinence. Sims conducted experiments on a woman named Anarcha, who had suffered from a vesico-vaginal fistula for years. This condition, caused by prolonged and obstructed labor, creates a hole between the bladder and the vagina, leading to incontinence. Sims often improvised with whatever tools he had on hand, resorting to a shoemaker's awl and even borrowing a silver spoon from his wife. He continued to perform these surgeries on black women for years until he developed a successful surgical technique. This technique was then applied to white women who were given anesthesia during the procedure. In recent times, statues honoring Dr. James Marion Sims have faced removal due to his unethical treatment of enslaved black women, particularly in the context of obstetrical experiments without their consent or anesthesia. His contributions to gynecology, once hailed, are now overshadowed by the acknowledgement of his exploitation and harm inflicted upon vulnerable populations.
An early morning strike, the statue of Dr. J. Marion Sims taken down, carted off in the back of a Parks Department truck. Sims losing his choice perch at 103rd and 5th Avenue after Mayor de Blasio's Monuments Commission determined the good that he did. He was known as the father of gynecology, the inventor of the speculum for female exams, was outweighed by the bad. He performed experimental surgery on female slaves without anesthesia. The debate continued even after Sims was carted off.
Thrilled. I read the horrible story about what he did to these black women in the South. Do we have a statue of Joseph Mengele in this park?
Sims' statue will be relocated at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, where he is buried. Officials say there will be a display explaining his history. Placing the sculpture near his gravesite is not meant to glorify him, said Greenwood President Richard J. Moylan. He said the facility plans to document Sims' story, including his shameful experimentation on enslaved women in the South between 1845 and 1849. Mayor de Blasio told me he wants to see
both sides of the story. It's very complex. It's not pretty. It's in some ways very painful, but it's not just one or the other side.
How do you think his descendants will feel reading these signs if they go to visit the grave of their ancestor?
I don't know, but I can just tell you, Greenwood Cemetery is, obviously a working cemetery, but it's also a major historical site. So I don't think it's sort of the same as if you're talking about a private secluded cemetery. I think this is a fair way to address a very thorny situation.
Enslaved women who eventually gave birth had no control over the fate of their babies. These infants were considered the property of their white masters from birth. Often taken away from their mothers as soon as they were weaned, sometimes as early as 6 weeks old, these children were treated as mere commodities to be traded and utilized as their owners saw fit. The conditions in which these children were raised were exceedingly grim. They were frequently subjected to arduous labor from a very young age, toiling in the fields or homes of their masters. Denied rights, freedoms, and any semblance of hope for a better life, they were born into a life of slavery, their destinies sealed from the moment they drew their first breath. One particularly grim example of this barbaric practice unfolded in Louisiana during the mid-1800s. There, a plantation owner named James H. Whitaker possessed over 300 slaves. Known for his exceptionally cruel treatment of his enslaved workforce, Whitaker gained notoriety for promptly selling off the offspring of enslaved women as soon as they were weaned. Indeed, Whitaker maintained a nursery on his plantation expressly for this purpose, where infants born to enslaved women were kept until they reached a suitable age for sale. Conditions within the nursery were abhorrent. The babies endured squalid and cramped quarters, often falling ill and suffering from malnourishment. Upon being sold, they were forcibly separated from their mothers, never to be reunited again. Yet, Whitaker was not unique in his actions. This deplorable practice was widespread throughout the American South and persisted throughout the entirety of the slavery era in the United States. Mothers were compelled to witness the wrenching separation from their children, with no prospect of ever seeing or hearing from them again. Children, robbed of parental care and affection, grew up devoid of love and hope. This law remained in force until the abolition of slavery in the United States, perpetuating the systematic breakup of families and the sale of children immediately upon weaning. It is estimated that over 400,000 children were born to enslaved women in Virginia alone, with many of them being sold to other slave owners, never to experience family bonds again. As we look back on this dark chapter in our history, we must remember that the legacy of slavery still lingers today. We must acknowledge the ways in which racism and inequality continue to affect Black women's lives and work towards a future where every person is treated with dignity and respect. We cannot forget these stories, and we must do everything in our power to make sure that something like this never happens again. Let us learn from the past to create a better future where we no longer tolerate the mistreatment of any human being. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe to stay on the channel and get more videos like this.